I'm just going to say very briefly a couple of things I'm not going to talk about, because there are so many things that I could have spent this 20 minutes talking about. I'm going to try not to get bogged down in discussions about nature versus nurture and how much differences in gender are innate. I'm very happy to have a conversation about that, but that's not what I'm going to talk about today if I can help it. And I'm not going to talk about how we do and don't involve children in our campaigning. Again, if people have got questions about that, I'm very happy to talk about that, but it's not the focus of what I've been talking about overall in the presentation. I've set up from my Twitter account to tweet links to some of the things I've talked about during the event. So I'm going to skip through quite a lot of stuff. A lot of the references to what I'm saying will be tweeted from my Twitter account, which is @day, D-A-Y, _J-E-S-S. So from about 5 to 3, those should start pinging out if you want any of them. So what is Let Toys Be Toys? Show of hands, who's heard of us? Yeah, reasonable. We feel like we've done pretty well in terms of getting visibility, given that we are basically a bunch of people who met online. We've been campaigning for nearly 3 years now. We've only ever met, any of us, twice. The first time any of us met face-to-face was 15 minutes before a formal meeting with Toys R Us. And we had to several people had to have, flowers in a train station so they recognised one another. It's all organised online. There's virtually no budget. A few £100 have passed through our bank account and that's it. And it grew out of a thread on Mumsnet. I wasn't involved in that. I got involved a little bit later. But we've had a fair bit of impact. 14 UK retailers have now changed or promised to drop boys and girls signage from the toy aisles, and that's been our key ask. That's where we've focused our attention on explicit gendered signage of toys. So not really looking, in our opinion, no toy is inherently gendered. The toys themselves are gender neutral in and of themselves. It's how they're presented, it's the packaging, it's the messaging around them that's gendered. And so the decision up front was to go for explicit signage as essentially the most obvious target. And yeah, 14 UK retailers have changed or are in the process of doing so. We've also looked at books from kind of encouragement from our supporters, and 9 publishers, including Penguin Random House Group as a whole, have committed to let books be books and drop girls and boys labelling from titles. We have a good practice award for retailers who model good practice in merchandising and marketing toys in an inclusive way. And we've also produced resources for schools, which seems like a little bit of a sidestep, but it was something that we were very much encouraged to do by our supporters. And again, if people have questions on that, I can talk about that a little bit more later. So what's it all about? Oh, no, not that one. Where did it come from? Okay, so this is what I'm talking about. These are the kind of signs and packaging you would have seen in shops in Christmas 2012, which was when the campaign kicked off with this Mumsnet thread, which started off with somebody going, is it just me, or has this got out of hand, essentially? And it really felt like it was a point where it really had. So this is the Entertainer at the top, which is a UK toy chain. This section is now called Construction Toys, which I think really we can all agree that finding construction toys under a sign that says Construction Toys is an easier way to find them than looking for Lego friends under boys, which isn't really helping anybody. At the bottom left, that's Marks and Spencer's, who had a big range of technical toys, so walkie-talkies and magnets and all this kind of stuff, all science-themed stuff, all explicitly marketed as boys' stuff. Top right, all the science museums, science toys marketed as gifts for boys in Boots, Christmas 2012. Bottom left, that's Centre Park's branded toy shops, which go a step further. So it's not just boys and girls, it's just boys and girls. Don't cross the line, kids. And this was my own moment of, really, this has got out of hand. This is a very crap photo I took in Next in Cardiff, Christmas 2012, before I'd heard of Let Toys Be Toys. I wanted to buy some jungle animals for my daughter. She's really into leopards. But it's kind of, why would I want to give her a box that says boy stuff on it? Why would you do that? So there was a whole unit of pocket fans and dinosaurs and all sorts of toys, all explicitly labelled on the packaging, boy stuff. And I suddenly realised that every single toy in Next was labelled boy stuff. So I turned around and went, well, what's the girl stuff? This is the girl stuff. There isn't a toy in this unit. It's all cosmetics and toiletries. Happy Christmas, darling. Go and have a wash. So I had a bit of a blood-boiling moment in Next, thinking, well, hang on, how dare they be telling my kids this is what they're supposed to find fun? My daughter isn't allowed to play with a leopard, and she's supposed to go and have Hello Kitty glitter sparkles instead. This is not on. And I tweeted next, and the response I got was, yeah, Let Toys Be Toys have already been in touch with us. Yeah, we made a mistake. But what's fascinating, what's interesting, is the fact that this has become so embedded in our culture that this went through marketing meeting after marketing meeting, months and months of planning, and this seemed normal to people. Many, if not most of whom, were probably women. And it seemed like a normal thing to do. So, what I want to do here is just talk about the fact that this is not consistent. You know, it's become a new normality, that it feels normal to have things labelled by gender, but the extent to which toys have been labelled and marketed by gender has fluctuated a great deal over time. So there's a researcher in the US called Elizabeth Sweet who is doing a really interesting piece of work looking at the Sears Wishbook, which is their Christmas catalogue, and how their toy marketing has been gendered over the years. So at the top left we have the 1920s, so very similar to what he was talking about, with kind of preparing girls for their roles as homemakers, and similarly in the 60s. Bottom right we have the 1970s with the little girl with her tool set and the little boy with the fridge. So things have changed quite a bit. But what's interesting is that even at the absolute peak of gender coding, probably only about 50% of the adverts, I think the 60s was what she identifies as the peak in the 20th century, still only about 50% of the adverts were explicitly coded as male or female. Whereas if you look at, for example, the Disney Store US website, all of the toys are coded as either female or male. You know, and very few items cross that boundary. And I don't know as much about the United States, but I understand that the gender coding is actually more extreme there than here. They haven't had a Let Toys Be Toys campaign yet. So this is just to sort of challenge a little bit the idea that this is, you know, it's consistent, or that it's traditional. And here's another example of how things have changed. So this is an image we put together. Somebody came up with a page from this is an Argos catalogue from the 70s on the left. And so we went through and looked for the equivalent products today. And you'll spot something fairly clear about them. So this is a big shift as well, this overall pinkification of girls' lives. So what you see is that pink becomes a very strong kind of coding that something is off limits for boys, basically. So what you see is that, you know, pink becomes a bit of it's masculinity kryptonite. You know, if you are involved with something pink, your boy status is compromised. And increasingly, a lot of girls, I think, do start to believe that if it's not pink, then it isn't for them. And this is quite extreme. I mean, I know girls in my own daughter's circle who really, it feels like their whole lives are pink, and the whole of the rest of the rainbow has disappeared. And, you know, and that is a change. That hasn't always been the case. So this is you've probably seen this before. It's gone around the internet quite a lot. This is from the early 1980s. And the reason I pull it up is partly because isn't it gorgeous? And isn't it a great example of how marketing toys doesn't have to be gendered? What I find interesting about this is that I was talking about it with a mum friend of mine who's quite a bit younger than me. And she was saying how lovely she found it. But, you know, did they really need to make a point by putting her in boys' clothes? And I said, in the early 1980s, those weren't boys' clothes. They were just clothes. You know, I had those DAPs in red and a T-shirt very similar to that. You know, but to her, as a younger woman, she doesn't remember that she doesn't remember a time where it felt normal for a girl to go out in a T-shirt and jeans and not be shouted at for dressing in boys' clothes, which is something that's happened to my daughter. But this has become the new normal. So what's the implication of this, and what are the causes, what are the drivers for this shift and this change in people's perceptions of normality? I'm going to skim over this a bit because I'll tweet a link to it. You can find out a bit more. You may have seen some kind of stuff about this. It got quite a lot of online coverage of Target, which is a very big US retailer, made a public announcement about dropping explicit gender signage. Now, most retailers, when they've done this, have just done it. You know, they've just taken the signs down. We've had a couple of retailers who've actually had a dialogue with us. Most of them have just taken the signs down and not really said anything about it. Target went a step further and made a public statement because this tweet on the left got a great deal of publicity, both positive and negative. The woman that tweeted it got, you know, misogynistic hate mail and all the usual stuff that you get for being a feminist campaigner these days. But Target came back and went, no, you're right. You're right, we're going to take these down. We're going to stop labelling things by gender that don't need to be labelled by gender. And a lot of people got very, very upset. Because apparently, some people think that actually boys not playing with dolls and girls not playing with trains is biblically sanctioned. I don't think Jesus had anything to say about toys. I really don't think he did. You know, but what it represents really is a massive anxiety among many people of anything that's to do with this a cultural shift that threatens their ideas of gender identity. And of course, with the changes in, you know, women entering the workplace, in what women can do, the space, if you define your masculine identity as being not female and not feminine, the space for that identity gets smaller and smaller. And that's very threatening for some people. And in some ways, these people are quite right to link these changes to the broader kind of culture wars. You know, this is, I'm not involved in this campaign purely because of toys. I'm involved in this campaign because I care about gender stereotyping. So there's, you know, there's a basic anxiety about gender changes. Another driver, you've got in the 1990s, you know, where kind of previously there'd been a lot of research and a lot of talk and a lot of feminist movements talking about kind of gender neutrality and equal opportunities. You've got this massive best-selling book. I mean, this is one of the best-selling non-fiction books ever. So, you know, it had an impact. It had a massive, massive impact. And of course, the whole idea, and I mean, a lot of this stuff's been debunked now anyway, but the basic idea that, oh yes, men and women operate differently is it feels commonsensical. We all recognise some of those stories. But of course, it's a massive leap to go from I can observe visible differences in the way adult men and women behave to drawing any conclusions whatsoever about innateness or about the reasons for those. I mean, that's basic science, isn't it? You know, just because you observe something doesn't mean you can make any inferences about the causes. And of course, if we say, you know, boys have been told to man up and boys don't cry since they were tiny, then it's not a great leap to think that might influence men perhaps being less emotionally literate or emotionally available as adults. So, you know, we don't have a control group of children who have not been exposed to gender conditioning. So, but you know, this had a great deal of traction, and I think there was a great movement to go, oh, you know, gender difference, it's innate, it's okay for boys to like trucks and girls to like dolls, you know, perhaps that's just normal and we're equal but different. So I think that, and it's in the mid-90s that you actually start to see the big surge in gendered marketing. There's a definite kind of timeline congruence there. And another issue is just more generally, and I said I'd try not to get bogged down in this, but I just think this is a really good example of just how badly science about gender gets reported in the media. So, you know, take the file drawer effect and multiply it by 10. That, you know, basically if something says, oh, we did not find any big differences between men and women, nobody is going to be publishing this. If you find something that shows a tiny, tiny difference between men and women, it will be all over the papers and generally quite misrepresented. And this is a great example, you know, so scientists say women have evolved to be indirectly aggressive. The closing line of this piece is that men do it too. You know, so essentially what it found is that people who are in positions of weakness relative to other people use indirect aggression. You know, that's not anything to do with innate gender difference in the brain, is it? So, but you know, why waste an excuse to have Lindsay Lohan and Mean Girls at the top of your article? So, what else is going on here? I was going to just say something about antenatal scans here, and just have a picture of an antenatal scan. But then, as I was putting this this presentation together, somebody tweeted us this, and I don't think I need to say any more, really, do I? I mean, there's also research about people talk about the physical activity of their unborn baby differently when they know whether it's a boy or a girl, and they talk about the activity. You know, he's fighter, you know. People project all kinds of ideas on their children before they're even born, and the fact that we know sooner means they don't even get that golden period before they pop out for us to start to think about them as individuals. So, you know, this poor little thing is a diva already, bless her. The rise in big parties. This is a massive opportunity for retailers. When I was a kid, you know, it was 6 kids and, you know, you'd get some balloons or something. You know, these days it's quite normal for kids to have parties with 20 or 30 children. The amount that people spend on presents has gone up massively. And this is a huge opportunity for the toy industry to sell products to people who have no idea of the likes and dislikes of the person they're buying for. All they know is this is a 6-year-old girl and I want to buy a socially acceptable present for her. So this is a massive opportunity to sell gendered crap, basically. So you know, ka-ching for the retailers. And another thing, the writer Peggy Orenstein, who wrote an excellent book called Cinderella Ate My Daughter, identifies the deregulation of children's broadcasting in the US in the 80s as a key factor, because that's when you start to get these very strong children's brands. So those of you who are old enough to remember will remember products like Rainbow Bright and the Transformers in the 80s, where suddenly you get TV programs that are basically toy marketing. And these start to be very, very gendered. So what you have is this massive opportunity for retailers to segment and sell more stuff. So, you know, if you've sold a family a pink chair for their daughter, they're going to feel obliged to buy a blue chair when their son comes along. He can't reuse the pink one, can he? Because, you know, boy kryptonite, etc. So it's one of the things we often, you know, when the accusation is leveled at us, is, you know, this is just what consumers want. Don't be fooled by this, because, you know, it's an opportunity for retailers to sell more stuff. They can sell the same thing twice in different colours. But also it's about protecting their brand. So for example, Disney bought Marvel. So, you know, Marvel, a franchise product now produced by Disney. It's not an accident that they leave the female characters out of merchandising and toy lines. It's not because there isn't a demand for them. It's because they don't want to compete with themselves. So, you know, if the girls who are already stitched up in the Princess brand start buying superhero stuff instead, they're competing with themselves. So it's much more profitable for the retailers to keep kids tidily in their segmented boxes, and they can sell more stuff. So obviously, you know, consumer demand has a part to play here, but this isn't simply a reflection of what consumers want when they're given more choice. It's more complex than that. And of course, when you dig deeper, what you see is that when you segment, you rely on immensely reductive gender stereotypes. So, you know, girls' fingerprints create totally different pictures to boy fingerprints. You know, boys get space, girls get flowers. Boys don't like flowers. Who would like flowers, you know? So advertising. This is a Wordle created by a blogger and writer called Crystal Smith, who blogs at theachilleseffect.com about the effects of gender stereotypes on boys. And this was something she did a few years ago, looking at keywords in adverts aimed at girls and boys on Canadian TV. So this is what the girls get. And interestingly, as we kind of touched on earlier with that change, you know, earlier, maybe 50, 60 years ago, the stuff that was targeted more at girls was about nurturing and preparation for your role as a future homemaker. But what we see here much more is preparation for your role as future wag? I don't know. It's about your future as a good consumer, essentially. It's fashion, it's style, it's sparkles, it's glamour, and you know, and if you look at the girl section, you know, the pink aisles in a toy shop, actually what you will see is much more of the kind of glamour and pop star type stuff these days than the traditional homemaker type toys. So this is what the boys get. As a parent of a rather sensitive little boy, I find this quite upsetting, to be honest. I'm very glad that we don't watch commercial television at home. And the one that really, really makes me upset is you probably can't even see it. Down underneath Special Forces, there's a little word there. It says friends. Boys don't need friends, do they? I refer you to my earlier point about male emotional, whatever. You know, this is quite sad, to be honest. So, and just another example, you know, I could go on all day with this, but, you know, here's a page from the Argos catalogue of dress up for girls and dress up for boys, with the notable exception of Doc McStuffins down at the right. We love Doc McStuffins. All of the girls' costumes are they're the canting poses. They're very submissive. They're very passive. These costumes are not about doing anything. They're about being pretty. There's not an activity associated, with the exception of Doc McStuffins. Whereas the boy costumes are all about action, they're about activity, they're about priming, active play, superhero narratives, that kind of thing, and look at the poses, look at the physical stances, you know, and this is why you end up with this girl can, you know, because this girl has been told quite a lot that she can't. She needs to stand there and look pretty. So, what do children take from this? You know, what do they understand? How are they affected by it? So this is a quote from a research study. The Girl Guiding UK do some amazing research with girls every year about girls' attitudes to different things. This was 2 years ago. 87% of girls think women are judged more on their appearance than their ability. And, you know, I kind of think, yeah, they're probably right. You know, they're not making this stuff up. They're not silly, these girls. Because, you know, look at what they're given. Look at what they're shown. Look at what they're around them. And, you know, for us as parents, you can't protect your child from this thing. You know, you can't immunize them to it. They are surrounded by it every day. And it's an incredibly powerful drip, drip, drip effect. So I highly recommend, there's a book by a project called Gender Diary, which was about cataloguing the drip, drip, drip effect of kind of gendered messages all around. I'll tweet a link to it later. But it is just, you know, once you start to see it, and you realise kind of how intense and how ongoing it is, that, you know, essentially, it doesn't matter what you do, all anybody cares about is what you look like. But what about the boys? This I find very interesting. Anyone seen this before? It's not very easy to read on this, not a great picture. This is taken from a project that the White Ribbon organisation who campaign on violence against women and girls did as part of a set of projects with Canadian boys, 8 to 10-year-old boys. So this isn't one boy, this was the output of a group of boys talking together about the bad things about being boys, being a boy or being male. And I find this fascinating because as a culture, we're quite ready to recognise the harm that's done to girls by gender stereotyping, because we've had decades of feminism working very hard to sensitise us to these issues. But because, you know, of the very clear hierarchy of gender, it's actually much harder for us to see the harm that's done to boys by telling them that they can't trade down, basically. So it's okay for girls to aspire to be chemists and engineers and to drive cars and have jobs and do all the things that used to be reserved for men. But we're a little bit behind the times in terms of opening up those opportunities to boys, which have traditionally been reserved to women. And it's interesting because obviously that's one, not being able to be a mother. Again, I'll tweet a link to it. There's a link to what that discussion was actually about. And he wasn't talking about being able to give birth, though that obviously was part of the discussion. He was talking about parenting, and he couldn't even imagine it because the guy said to him, well, you can be a dad. And to the child concerned, he obviously just didn't see that a nurturing father was not something he could imagine. Because it's not, you know, it's not shown to him, it's not something he's been encouraged to see. You know, we find it much harder to see what boys are missing out of because we don't value feminine things, essentially, in our culture. But the boys are missing out too from stereotypes. I think again, I'll tweet the research. There's a lot of concern, understandably, about boys' underperformance in school. And the response very often is to go, oh, we have to boy up things, we have a more boy-friendly curriculum. And that's actually the last thing we need, because essentially what we have here is a situation where, you know, girls are achieving. If the only way you can define yourself as a boy is to be not a girl, then again, you're going back to this, you know, the stereotype is negative, the stereotype is to not do what the girls are doing. The way to challenge this issue of boys' underperformance is to challenge gender stereotypes, and girls and boys will benefit by that, and there is research on this. And there is little to no evidence that boy-friendly curriculums actually have any beneficial effect on boys' educational performance, whereas challenging gender stereotypes, there is evidence that it does. You know, I just find this really troubling. 18% of boys think that reading is for girls, you know. And if you give him a book that says books for boys on it, what's the implication of that? You know, what is he learning from that? It might get him to read this book because this one is safe. This one is a boy-friendly book. But what he's learning is that you're at risk of social exclusion and social damage if you touch any of those books, because they're probably girls' books, because reading is probably for girls. So this kind of thing, I think, is incredibly counterproductive. Well-intentioned, perhaps, but counterproductive. And kids really are taking this stuff in. They are listening, they are understanding it, and the messages from marketing are sometimes even more powerful than what they see in the real world. I mean, I find it hard to believe this still exists, but it gets tweeted to us very regularly. And in fact, the day before yesterday, somebody tweeted to say this is still on sale in Smith's in Cardiff. Can you believe this? So yes, and where would my daughter have got the idea that men are doctors and girls are nurses, as she popped out the other day? You know, practically every doctor she's ever met has been a woman. So, you know, the real world, it has nothing to say against this. You know, this is a more overwhelming message to her than actually the fact on the ground. So it has real power. And the real challenge here is that what children are getting from toy marketing and toy packaging and the way that toys are presented to them is their first introduction to the idea that gender is going to define every choice that's made for them. So as future adults, they've already realised, you know, they've already been told that, you know, this is the box that you've got to live inside. So very well-meaning and excellent campaigns to try and get more girls to do physics or to go into STEM careers are very well-intentioned, but they are largely 10, 12 years too late. You know, unless you're working at the level of early childhood to challenge stereotypes, you've got a really serious uphill battle to persuade children that actually all choices are on the table for them. And, you know, it's not to children's benefit to believe that those boxes are for them. And of course we don't see nearly as much discussion or active campaigns to talk about how we can get more men into nursing or how more men into caring or teaching. But if we believe that, you know, the construction and engineering and science world can benefit from talented women, then actually I also believe that caring and nurturing and education professions can also benefit from the input of talented and amazing men. And, you know, I'm sure we've all noticed how few men are in the room today. You know, I believe that men are just as concerned about future generations, but, you know, we need to make sure that those areas which have been traditionally reserved for women are as welcoming and as rewarding for men as they are, as we hope that science careers can be for girls. So why is it important to challenge it? I mean, I don't get paid for this, you know, this is something I do in my own time and that all of us involved in the campaign do in our own time. And I don't just do it for my own children, I don't just do it because individual children are the victims of gender-based bullying as a result of this kind of nonsense, or that their choices are limited, or that, you know, it limits their opportunities to learn, though I do care very deeply about those things. The reason I care so passionately about it is that because I think that if you want to challenge gender inequality and you want to talk about gender equity, then you need to start at the roots and you need to talk about how do children learn that they are not equal.